Among the ways that we do that here at VBS and in the community at large is with the wonderful work of the Harold M. Schulweis Institute. The Institute maintains a website which has hundreds and hundreds of the rabbi's addresses, speeches, articles, and thoughts. It maintains a library here at VBS. It maintains a series of programs during the course of the year around the community as well as here that carry on the rabbi's legacy. Tonight, our Yahrzeit celebration, commemoration, is sponsored in part by the Schulweis Institute. I'd like to welcome Sylvia Tregub, who is the chairperson of the Institute. You just have to hold this and pretend that you're a Vegas singer. Celine Dion.
Good evening. In welcoming you, let me ask you, what is your legacy? How do you want to be remembered? What aspect of your life will you pass down to future generations? Your responses quite naturally would be very personal. At the Schulweis Institute, we are entrusted with preserving and advocating the legacy of our revered teacher, Rabbi Harold Schulweis, Zichrono Livracha. It is a sacred trust and one that we take very personally. For our eyes and our hearts have been opened and our lives have been blessed by the moral compass of a visionary whose teachings have been transformative, impacting all aspects of our communal, religious, and personal lives. Through his writings, oratory, and poetry, as relevant now as when some of it was first composed decades ago, our lives continue to be enriched. Though at times his mood was reflective, I don't recall him ever being passive. Quite the contrary. He was passionate about his many causes. And that excitement continues to this day under the inspired leadership of Rabbi Ed Feinstein and our clergy, Rabbis Josh Hoffman, Noah Farkas, and Avi Taff. That spirit assures the perpetuation of Rabbi Schulweis's legacy. He taught that each one of us has a spark of divinity, and we are obligated to use that spark to improve the world, to seeing the goodness in people and honoring it, to loving our neighbor, to feeding the hungry, to welcoming the stranger, to reaching out to those in need of support, to pursuing peace. That what we do matters. He gave us permission to challenge and to think not in terms of what is, but in terms of what ought to be. What ought we do to teach the relevancy of our 4,000-year-old tradition? The Harold M. Schulweis Institute was created 13 years ago with the support of 10 very generous Valley Beth Shalom members to mark the rabbi's 80th birthday. Some of those members are here today, and we thank them. First, benefiting from the very dedicated leadership of Buzzy Bookman, my good friend and mentor, and our board and governors, we continue to take the rabbi's teachings and the perpetuation of that legacy very seriously. Rabbi Feinstein mentioned our online library. You can reach it at hmsi.org, chaired by Bert Tregub and Bill Green. You can access all of the rabbi's writings and sermons, as tens of thousands of people have done over the years. The Institute's publication of the beautifully bound keepsake edition of From Prose to Poetry, with graphic design by Pat Cater, contains over 140 of the rabbi's poems and teachings related to life cycle events. And the Institute supports programs here at Valley Beth Shalom, as well as Jewish World Watch and the Jewish Community Children's Choir, and the Schulweis Rabbinic Series at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at American Jewish University, and programs this weekend where we'll be learning from Imam Jihad Turk and the Reverend Mart Whitlock. We are indebted and thankful to Malka Schulweis for her inspiration and encouragement through which the Rabbi's legacy will continue to enrich our lives in a world in need of so much repair. If we get it right, and I pray that we do, the legacy of Harold M. Schulweis can become our moral compass to proudly pass on to future generations. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. We're very delighted that everyone is here. Permit me just a moment to offer a few introductions. We'd like to welcome David Spiegel, who's president of Valley Beth Shalom. Welcome, David. A very special welcome, of course, to Malka and to all the members of the Schulweis family. Thank you all for coming tonight. A very special welcome to my colleagues and partners, Rabbi Hoffman and Rabbi Farkas, and our guest, I think Rabbi Sella is here as well. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you to be with us this weekend. A very special welcome to Matt Weintraub, who's our new executive director. Welcome to your wife. I'm delighted that you're here with us as part of our community. Orit Rappaport is running around taking care of all of the arrangements. Thank you, Orit, for all of your efforts to make tonight so very, very special. Cantor Barron, Cantor Fox, my other partners here at VBS, thank you for sharing this lovely evening with us as well. These are all very, very special, special moments for us to share. Tonight is the fourth Yahrzeit for Rabbi Schulweis. Tonight we remember his teaching, his greatness, his spirit, the power of his soul. To help us remember, we're going to have a very short tribute, which was written by Elisa and will be read by Eli Noah.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and good Shabbos. I'm going to undo my origami. Okay. So these are not my words. They are the words written by my mother. This year, the hateful racism we've been seeing, as well as the loving resistance to it we've joined, made me think of my dad's role in the civil rights movement and its impact on his theology. In the early 60s, my dad was not just the first rabbi, not just the first white clergyman, but the first Caucasian ever on the Oakland board of the NAACP. This earned us the splashing of a swastika on our front curb, which we kids weren't told about until we were much older. But my brothers and I did get to witness firsthand an extraordinary civil rights event. One of my most vivid memories, I was probably 6, is of hearing my dad speak, along with many black clergy, at a massive rally in the Oakland auditorium. He talked about our prophetic tradition of social justice and our commandments to protect the weak. He spoke especially about our journey from slavery to redemption, which our liturgy reminds us of yearly, weekly, and 3 times daily. That experience created the Jewish people. But, he said, it also created Jewish persons who understood and stood with Negroes, which was the politically correct term in the time period, as they struggled for equality. The crowd jumped to its feet and deafened us with shouts. Naturally, everybody in my family focused on different aspects of this event. My mother recalled the hate mail that followed, some of it from existing congregants, I'm sorry to say. Exiting congregants. I'm sorry to say. My brothers remembered the standing room only sea of bodies overflowing the enormous venue, which comfortably held the bad old days 3-ring circuses, complete with whole herds of elephants we went to each summer. And I can still see the endless row of giant, bright blue-shirted Oakland police, each with a wood baton, held high, rigid across his chest, a uniformed white wall pressing against the black crowd to carve a path for us and the speakers to get to the stage. Typically, though, my dad never forgot the words of a black minister who embraced him after the ovation. Rabbi, that was a wonderful speech, but you know, I could never tell my people, remember you were slaves. That memory of my dad's is telling. First off, it shows how long and how windingly the road towards equality stretches back to before the Black Lives Matter, before 12 Years a Slave, before Roots, before the Black Pride movement. At the same time, it marks the crystallizing of my dad's effort to resolve the tension between Jewish particularism and Jewish universalism. He had long rejected the claim that we were the chosen people as simplistic and passive, and taught instead that we are a choosing people. And what Jewish history has led us to choose is the core challenge of monotheism, viewing all peoples as created and loved by the same one God. I think participation in the civil rights movement clarified for him the dynamic connection between Judaism as a nation-based religion and as a world religion. He came to see that our very particularity fixes us firmly in a diverse world. That is, the specific elements of Jewish civilization, our history, Torah, ritual, languages, arts, partnership with God, pursuit of social justice, do not impart an identity to us the way that a gift is given. It's only by actively choosing to celebrate, wrestle with, and apply these elements that we create our exceptional Jewish self. And in doing that, we learn to treasure the unique but intersecting histories and insights of other nations. I know my dad would have felt that now more than ever. We need to draw on our exclusive experience in order to deepen our inclusive empathy. So that is this note. I personally do not consider myself a wise sage, but I'd like to add one brief sentence, something I've been thinking about recently. I think it's really crucial for everyone as individuals, as part of a larger group, to take a step back in the way you see yourself and recognize how absolutely essential it is to start at a foundational self-respect, because I think that then leads to self-understanding, which then leads to the capability of understanding someone else. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, I'll just use it for another minute. No, leave it. What? On this one, because that's like, we'll figure it out. This is a new sound system. We're learning how to use it. Rabbi Schulweis typically began thinking about what he would say at high holidays in the springtime before. It wasn't unusual for him to come to Passover and ask me, what are you going to speak about Rosh Hashanah? And I said, I don't know what I'm going to speak about tomorrow. And he would say, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to speak about. And he would begin thinking of a topic during springtime, and he would spend the summer reading in that topic and arrive at whatever he wanted to say. And you remember that whenever he gave a great address, it always included a program that followed, which was usually my responsibility to put together. So he would say, all right, so here's what I need. In the springtime of the year 2001, he began to be concerned with the fact that Americans are so disconnected with the rest of the world. This sense that Americans are turned inward and not outward, and that American religion was inward and not outward. And he said, I want to talk about globalism. And I want to talk about the idea that we are a global people. We practice a global faith. The God we worship is a God of the world. We worship that God in our own language, but the God is the God of the world. The bracha that we say says, Melech HaOlam, God of the world. Now, he didn't know that 6 days before the high holidays would be 9/11. But on 9/11, the United States of America suddenly became acutely aware that we are connected to the rest of the world. And we had already planned a series of programs. And if you remember what happened, there was this tremendous sense of shock in the community. And people started coming to synagogue in very great numbers. And we had already planned a lecture series on the world's religions to ask them, what does religion say to the world? And we had thousands of people coming. So one night was about Buddhism, and one night about Christianity, and a remarkable night about Islam. And Islam was the most controversial given the events of 9/11, but there was a palpable sense in the world, in the room, that we are in this together, that we are a world community, and that we must listen carefully to each other. And this was Rabbi Schulweis's remarkable prophetic gift, to know that this was the right moment to ask the right question. Malka and I, Sylvia, members of the community, sat this year and asked ourselves, what is the question we need to ask this year? And we decided that this question returns to us now. It's time to ask once again, what do we say to the world? What is our responsibility to the world? And how can we work, how can we bridge, how can we reach out and join with other communities of faith to touch the world? So this Yahrzeit commemoration and celebration, we're going to ask the question, what does religion say to the world? What does religion say to each other? Can we work together in this? Who is the God that we all worship together? And we've invited two extraordinary religious leaders to be with us tonight, Imam Jihad Turk, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And tomorrow morning we'll have Torah study as usual, and then service, and then lunch. And at 12:30 we'll gather back in this room again for our second conversation with the Reverend Mark Whitlock. Reverend Whitlock is the protege of the Reverend Chip Murray of the First AME Church. He leads Christ Our Redeemer Church in Irvine, which is the largest African-American church in Irvine, in Orange County. And he's the director of the Chip Murray Center of Social Ethics at USC. Conversation on what we have to say to the world and how religion can heal a very, very broken world. Please come back. Please just stay in your seats. Don't even leave. Just stay right here. Stay right here and join us. Tonight we are joined by a wonderful dear friend, a friend of the community, a friend of ours, and a wonderful teacher in the world of religious communities. The Imam Jihad Turk is the first president and the inaugural president of the Bayan Claremont Islamic College, the first American Islamic college. He is a leader in the Los Angeles Islamic community, a leader in the national and world Islamic communities. He has a degree from Berkeley. He's working on a PhD from UCLA, every Jewish mother's dream, right? He's a wonderful teacher. He's one of the founders of the Jewish-Muslim dialogue that's been going on in this city for decades and decades. Please welcome Imam Jihad Turk. Sound system, so we're trying this out. If it doesn't work, like it doesn't work already, it doesn't work. Better not do that. That doesn't sound too good. A little feedback, yeah. Try this one instead. Wait. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Does that work?
Not yet.
Does that work? I get no kick. Good. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Good. Tonight we remember our teacher, Rabbi Schulweis. So I know you spent time with him and met him as well.
Here in this room, we were on
right
on a panel together about 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I have many, many questions. I think the community has many questions, but I want to start right at the heart of the matter. Rabbi Schulweis argued to us many, many times that while religion must have its deepest concern with the inner life must always lead to an outer life. Religion must touch the world. But whenever you touch the world, you become political. It's sort of inevitable, because the world is politics. The world is multiple interests, multiple centers of power, and a vigorous, passionate debate about the common good. So tell us, how Islam as a tradition deals with this question of the inner life and the outer life and the political?
This is such an important question with all that's going on in the world. First of all, let me just, for those who aren't in tune with the demographics, is this so you can hear me okay? Yeah. All right. There are, according to Pew, 24% of the world's population is Muslim. That's 1.7 billion people out there identify as Muslim. So half of Africa is Muslim. There are upwards of 30 million Muslims in China. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country with around 200 plus million Muslims that live there. So when we think of Islam, we might always think of the Arab world, but the Arab world only makes up about 15%, 15% of the Muslim population out there. So as Bernard Lewis from Princeton would say in his book, What Went Wrong with Islam, Islam has bloody borders, right? There are a lot of places of conflict, and Islamism is somehow, political Islam is somehow involved in a lot of these conflicts around the world. So what is happening is that Muslim societies are involved in some kinds of political, military disputes, conflicts, and are really at the if you trace where there's conflict in the Muslim majority countries, it tends to be where there are challenges in catching up to modernity. And what I mean by that is the world is made up of nation states, and there are nation states that have a well-established civil society, and then there are nation states that are failed states. You can think of Somalia, for example, or you can think of Afghanistan, and other places in which there is not a stable governance, and there are conflicts that arise as to how those places will be governed. Some of those places are entirely Muslim populations, or almost entirely Muslim populations, and some of those places, Muslims make up a significant portion or a minority, but a significant enough minority where in today's world of identity politics, groupings of people who coalesce around religious identity might be involved in that struggle. So I want to say something about that in a little while, but the question you asked me is, what does Islam say about politics? And to answer the question in a very concise way, as you indicated, religion, when done right, not only elevates the individual self to try and attain a position of awareness of God and one's understanding in being humble and grateful to God for one's existence, but manifesting that in a way that impacts society through values of charity and compassion and justice, social justice. So accordingly, the Quran says something that would be akin to the teachings in the Bible, and I'll say the Arabic, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ, that you as a believer should enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. In other words, as an expression of your faith, you should be active in society in upholding good values and ensuring that social justice reigns in the public sphere. However, Islam as an organized religion, I would argue, is the most disorganized organized religion on the planet, in that there is no central figure. There is no hierarchy. There's not even ordination. So even though I'm an Imam, I was not ordained. And so what is the role between religion and governance? I think what we have going on here in the United States is maybe a great example of the way religious values, either as Jews or as Muslims or Christians, we can let our moral conscience inform our political activism without it being the church, the synagogue, or the mosque that is somehow involved in political races or the details of politics, but rather it's a moral impetus. It's an urging of people to get involved as they understand they should manifest their values in society, in supporting this or that policy, or even congressional or political candidate. So the answer is not clear, it's not black and white, but you should be involved, but how exactly you should do that is subject to one's moral compass, one's moral lens by which they view the particulars of their circumstance, always informed by social justice, by mercy, compassion, and love, which are the themes of the scripture of the Quran.
Got that? Good. In the last election, I think there were two Muslim women who were now elected to Congress. It's kind of a new thing for America, a new face of American legislation. When I was a little kid, John Kennedy was elected to the presidency, and as he was running for the presidency, he had a lot of opposition because people were afraid that as a Catholic, that would mean that the Pope was making American policy. People said a similar kind of thing when Mitt Romney ran for president, that because he was a faithful Muslim, Mormon Muslim, you know.
I thought we had breaking news tonight.
Yeah. That would be interesting, Doc. State of Utah. As a faithful Mormon, that the Mormon Church would have a sort of an effect on his policy making. Is there an effect on policy making for a Muslim who becomes a member of Congress?
So I had this conversation before, and I've met, not Ilhan, but I've met Rashida. And before her, there are two other Muslim congressmen, both of them, Keith Ellison and Andre Carson. Keith Ellison from Minnesota and Andre Carson. And I asked him that question, actually, directly. And what he told me was that his religious values inform his commitment to those same values that we were talking about, social justice, et cetera, and inspire him to be hardworking and honest and trustworthy, so that when he is elected to represent his constituency, he does so for the betterment of all of his, the society at large, and the Constitution, but his constituency in particular. So, I mean, in so much as religion, when done right, makes you a better person, it informed him in that way. But he's not considering what Islamic law says in his, supporting a particular piece of legislation. One of our faculty members is a professor of Islamic law and U.S. Constitution. She's a Guggenheim Fellow, Harvard trained. She's based in Madison, Wisconsin, and she speaks to our students who are imams and leaders in their own right. She speaks to them about this issue, this nexus between citizenship in the United States and the nexus with Islamic law. And what she suggests is that Islamic law is governing things that are very specific to Muslim societies, such as, we have our version of kosher, halal, or, what's ritually pure. And also in Islamic law addresses things that are would fall outside of the realm of law in the Western sense. So personal law, things like, how to perform one's obligation regarding prayer. These are part of this of what's known as Sharia. It doesn't. People always think it has to do with stoning or cutting of hands, etc. There is a penal code, but that's if there is an Islamic government in place. But most of the law, overwhelming percentage, it has to do with these other mundane issues. However, a significant portion of Islamic law, i.e. governance, is known as siyasa, is kind of outside of the realm of scripture. So a traffic, the speed limit or the traffic laws in the United States would fall under this idea of siyasa, which is up to the governance of the whatever society. And so Islamic law, although in theory covers all aspects of one's behavior, it also carves out how a society through legislation could govern itself regarding all of these other matters that are addressed in the legal code within the tradition. And so accordingly, we teach our students, and it's the understanding, I would say, of most American Muslims at least, who not only live in the United States in a democratic society, but embrace it wholeheartedly and would go so far as to say the best place in the world to practice Islam is a free Western liberal democratic society, and the United States in particular. They would say that there's not a conflict between their understanding of Islamic law and their citizenship under the Constitution of the United States of America.
The best place to practice Islam is better than an Islamic state?
Yes. And I'm one of those people who would say that the best place in the planet to be a Muslim is the United States of America, because of the non-establishment clause in the U.S. Constitution, which prevents the central government from preferring one religion over the other. So there's a separation, if you will, and really no interference. Our central government, our federal government, does not interfere with how we understand our faith. So this is really the only place. Even I've been to Europe. I was, I traveled with the British Council and for a number over the last 10 years or so to Europe a number of times, looking at how European governments deal with Muslim minority populations. And they don't, even in Britain, they have this thing called British values. They don't have the First Amendment as we know it with all that entails. And so looking at all of the other, even Western liberal democracies, none of them quite have that complete separation and freedom that we have here in the United States with regards to religion. And this, therefore, allows Islam, in this context, to grow and manifest itself in a way that's organic, that is authentic, and that is free from government interference. And what you find in even Muslim-majority countries where they enjoy authenticity or authority, like let's say Egypt has Al-Azhar University, the oldest university in the world, established in the year 972. This is kind of like the most prestigious seminary or Islamic seat of learning in the world, but in 1952 it was nationalized, meaning it had been operating for the first 1,000 years or so on almost 1,000 years on endowments, but the state of Egypt under the Nasser regime, they nationalized it and made all of the faculty there government employees, which means that their moral authority then was co-opted by the state. And so when, let's say, the people were demanding democracy, the Mubarak, who was in power until the Arab Spring came along, he then would put pressure on the rector of Al-Azhar University to issue a decree or an edict, a fatwa, condemning protest as somehow being immoral. So they've lost that sort of independence from their state sponsors to be able to speak truth to power and to speak with moral clarity. And I would say that's the case for pretty much every major Islamic institution and Muslim society around the world, except here in the United States. And so we, as, for example, an institution of higher education, we, on principle, do not take foreign government money so that we can speak with clarity, moral clarity and conscience in condemning Saudi Arabia for all of its atrocities, including not just the murder of the one Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist, but of the tens of thousands of people that they're murdering in Yemen, in the war in Yemen, and other kinds of transgressions that they. At the same time, we can condemn Iran for all of the bloodshed and war making that they're engaging in the region. So we can speak with a kind of moral clarity that's not tied to government and their agendas, but we can say, well, what does our religion teach us about what is truly just and moral And so we on principle enjoy that freedom here and exercise it.
I've got lots more questions now. Gosh. So, I mean, one of my questions is, what is the relationship then between the civic values of an American-style liberal democracy and what I understand is the sort of authoritarian values of traditional Islam? And how do you mediate between those two?
Well, I
Is that
would
a fair-
argue,
is that a fair
that's a very
question?
fair
Oh,
question.
okay.
What I would argue is that 1,400 years ago when Muhammad lived, he lived in sort of a lawless, tribal society of Arabia, which was nomadic. There were a few tribes that were settled, but most tribes were independent from one another, and there was a few safe spaces, like where in Mecca, where the temple of the Kaaba was the sanctuary of the Kaaba was built, Muslims believe, by Abraham and his son Ishmael, to worship the one true God, right? So there's the establishment of monotheism that we all share in the patriarch of Abraham. That was a place that the Arabs recognized as a sacred space, and they wouldn't go to war with one another there. But there were scarce resources, very little water, and they had trade routes, and they would raid each other's caravans as they did. They had these trade routes that would go through the deserts of Arabia. So it was a very dangerous place, and each tribe was unto itself its own sort of fiefdom. Along comes Muhammad, and in the short span of 23 years, preaching to those people, was able to convince them to leave aside the worship of false idols and to worship the God of Abraham, and united them for the first time in their history into one people. Now, he was a prophetic figure, and so he was, by default, the spiritual leader and the political leader. And so what he, I would argue, attempted to, where he focused his energy on, was on rebuilding the human character. And he says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتِمَّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. He said, I was sent for no other purpose than to teach good manners, good moral conduct, good behavior. So that was kind of his mission, and the focus of his teachings was on being a good person. And when he died, he didn't leave in place clarity as to how people should be governed. What the Quran says is, you should consult with one another on matters of governance. But that's all it says. It doesn't say exactly how elections or no elections or tribal structure or authoritarian or non-authoritarian. And so what happened was, after he passed, there was confusion. And there was even infighting amongst his followers to say, okay, well, who's going to lead? At first it was one of his close companions, and then another close companion, then a third close companion, then his cousin, who was also his son-in-law, who had married his daughter, Ali ibn Abi Talib. So you had a succession of these four individuals who were relatively close to one another and close to him. But then the challenge came from outside, and what the rule of the day, the way that societies were organized, were in, you had dynasties, dynastic rule, and empires. That was the way that society was organized at that time, 1,400 years ago. And so the system of governance was just adopted from what was out there in the world. It's not an Islamic form of governance. It was just, that's what worked. And then Muslims who rose to power did so by force, and whoever could, who had the power could rule. They did, and they conquered the territory, and there was infighting until they secured the reins of power. Then they expanded. But this wasn't an Islamic rule. This was rule. This was governance. This was, brute force. This is the way that all societies worked back then. And there was a split at that early time, after the first four successors of Muhammad, between the religious leadership and the state leadership, where there was this tension, this kind of interplay, where if the rulers went too far in either imposing or oppressing the people regarding their religious freedom, then the religious class or the clergy people that were somewhat independent would say, you've crossed the line, it's permissible for people to rebel against the government. And they had the moral authority to issue that sort of, decree. And so the government would try and push the envelope but not cross the line. And at the same time, if the government did not, or the governments, I should say, the dynasties, allowed for the practice of religion and there wasn't too much oppression, then the religious class would say it's not okay to rebel because rebellion leads to much bloodshed and its own travesty. And so they kind of were mediators for much of Islamic history. Fast forward to today, the world transformed from a world of empires to a world of nation states. And here, this is, I think, getting at the root of what we see going on in the world in terms of conflict, and we can even tie it to the Israeli-Palestine conflict as well. Foucault would suggest that the modern world, the modern nationalist identity, nation states, is a more efficient way of governing. Because if you think about it, if you're an empire, you're multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic, vast territories, and all you really cared about was controlling the territory and the resources and taxing people. And you would tax people in ways that were quite inefficient. That you would do something called, again, this is maybe 500-600 years ago, you do something called tax farming. The Ottomans did this. And what is tax farming? It means that you would take, for example, a territory, let's say like Iraq, and you would sell Iraq, you would sell the governorship of Iraq to a local, powerful leader for X amount of money. For a 5-year period, that person would be the governor of that territory. And let's say they paid you, I don't know, $1 billion for a 5-year term. You've collected your taxes up front. They get to extract as many taxes as they want out of that population, and they could do so, and it would cost them. They have to raise the army, they have to extract the taxes, but they have to, also walk that fine line so that they don't get the people to rebel against them. And so this is a highly inefficient way to govern and to get taxes. In the modern system that we use to govern ourselves, which is much more efficient, we divide ourselves into more monolithic groups. United States aside, if you look at the rest of the world, most nation states, their nationalist identity circulate around, as Foucault would say, 5 aspects of their identity. Religion is one of them, but the other 4 include culture, history, language, and land. So religion, culture, history, language, and land. Those 5 things, to a greater or lesser extent, in each of the nationalist identities around the world, play an important role. And where you find conflict in the world, I would say, you can look at all of the places of conflict around the world through a unified lens and say it's not religion per se that's causing the conflict. It's a conflict of nationalisms. And I want to give a couple of examples, if I may, on this topic, because I think it'll bring us some great clarity as to what's going on wrong in the world, and then hopefully a spark of hope as to what we might be able to do as people of faith. So on this point, let's take a few examples that you might be familiar with. Northern Ireland, outside of the Muslim world, and then we'll bring it inside the Muslim world. So Northern Ireland, who was fighting in Northern Ireland? They were Irish, right? They all spoke the same language. They had the same land, same culture, same history. They disagreed on one of those important points of modern nationalist identity, which was religion. Half were Protestant, the other half were Catholic. So they battled over control over the state. Now, of course, there's the history of the Anglican Church supporting the Protestants, and so, there was the legacy of colonialism and other factors, and economics always plays a role. But these 2 groups, otherwise the same identity, differed on this one aspect of their identity group, right? We call it identity politics today. And so they ended up engaging in armed conflict. That invoked terrorism even. I was invited by one of the high-ranking members of the Catholic Church a number of years ago to speak about Islam to his congregation. And before he invited me up, because he knew people were going to start thinking, okay, Islam and terrorism, he said, let me talk to you about Northern Ireland, in which the Catholics were involved in, the IRA, involved in terrorism, bombing, soft targets and all of these things. And he said, nothing in our teachings justify that behavior. So we want to learn from this person, but let's just keep in mind we might be looking in a very particular way because of current events, but let's not forget our not too recent past. So that's one example. I want to skip around to a few different places and then bring it, like I said, back to Islam. Another example is the Basques in northern Spain. Now, that conflict has been resolved recently, but for decades, northern Spain, the Pyrenees Mountains, there was a people there that wanted to have independence. So the Basques were Catholic, and most of the Spaniards were also Catholic. But the Basques had their own language, their own culture, their own history, and their own territory, which was the Pyrenees Mountains. And they wanted their independence. They wanted their autonomy. They wanted their own nation state. And so what did they do? They employed asymmetric warfare tactics, terrorism, to try and secure their independence. Again, not knocking on Catholicism, but they weren't justified in doing so because of Catholicism. It was part of their nationalist identity, and so they used whatever expedient techniques that they wanted to in order to get their independence. Let's take it out. Let's stop picking on the Catholics, and let's take it to another example that the UN recently called a genocide. I'm talking about Myanmar or Burma. Now, imagine this. What is the most peaceful world in the, religion in the world? Buddhism, right? So the U.S. State Department sent to our university, because we are not only in, we're a Muslim seminary embedded in a Christian seminary, Claremont School of Theology, in partnership with a Jewish seminary, Academy for Jewish Religion, California, and a Buddhist university, University of the West, the historic Buddhist university. So the U.S. State Department sent us a delegation from the Rakhine State. This is during the first flare-up of the genocide about 6 years ago. They sent us a delegation from there of Buddhist monks and Muslim leaders, political and religious leaders. And they visited us at the university, and they were on a tour of a few important places in the United States. And they were here, brought by the U.S. State Department in order to explore. And I said, why are you here? They said, we want to learn how Muslims and Buddhists can get along. And I said, well, first of all, you guys are Buddhists. You're the most peaceful religion on the planet. What's going on? Why are you coming to us to learn how you can, live in peace? He said, this is the Buddhist monk now who answered. And he obviously was not one of those Buddhist monks that was promoting the violence. So he said, we used to be a military dictatorship in Myanmar, in Burma. Now they call themselves Myanmar. Only 2% of the population, by the way, is Muslim, 98% Buddhist. So he said, we used to be a military dictatorship. We recently became a democracy. And the military did not want to give up their power. So he said the military intelligence infiltrated our Buddhist monasteries to become monks, to be able to instrumentalize Buddhism as part of an ultra-nationalist narrative to rally the people together and make sure that the military would remain in power because we would be able to scare people about the Muslims. This is the Buddhist monk who's telling me this. So Buddhism is being instrumentalized by ultra-nationalists as a weapon to weaponize the religion to motivate people to go out. And when I'm talking about genocide, I'm talking about not just the military, but people who attend these Buddhist, the temples, to encourage them to go out and hack up. I mean, it's really gruesome, and I don't want to get into the details, but very gruesome things. Your average person going out and being motivated by this rhetoric from some of these extremist Buddhist monks. It doesn't even sound like it's a real thing, but again, the UN recently declared it a genocide that's taking place there, and it's being fully supported by some of these Buddhist monks. And one of them was featured on Time magazine, the cover of Time magazine a little while ago. I'll finish up quickly. I know this is a long answer. One more outside, and then we'll take it home. Rwanda. 1 million people killed in that genocide in Rwanda. Who was fighting? They're all Rwandan. They were all black Africans. Well, they were, but there were two tribal identities, the Hutus and the Tutsis, right? The Hutus were 98% of the population, the Tutsis were 11%. And there was a history of colonialism there, and the Belgians, et cetera, might have favored one group over the other and gave them advantage. They were the smaller in number. Other regional powers had some hand in the matter, weaponization, et cetera. There was a powder keg, it erupted. And the two nationalist identities or tribal identities, which really we're talking about, ultranationalism is a form of tribalism, right? It's a way that we say that we are part of our tribe and you're not our tribe. And I know in the Jewish community say, oh, you're one of the tribe, but not in a negative way, right? But here it could be taken in a negative way where you're literally part of our tribe or figuratively part of our tribe, and you're making an enemy out of the other. I almost said enemizing. That's not a word. All right. So you're almost making an enemy out of the other and then dehumanizing the other and then justifying violence against the other. And so this happened in Rwanda and resulted in over 1 million people being brutally murdered by their neighbors in many cases. And so here you had two different ideas of what nationalist identity was, and it had been rooted in tribal identity. But where there is a disagreement as to what is our identity as a nation, and you don't have a strong civil society and rule of law, et cetera, and institutions to maintain the peace, it can really erupt into a kind of violence. And it gets worse when you have neighboring countries that are stoking the flames and fueling the fire by supplying arms and sometimes rhetoric from outside to complicate things. Now taking it inside the Muslim world. And what I mean by the Muslim world is, obviously Muslim majority countries are places in which Muslims historically have lived, and there's some conflict there. So let's take, for example, Iraq. Iraq is, well, actually one step before Iraq, Turkey. So Turkey used to be the Ottoman Empire, right? Known as the sick man of Europe, et cetera. World War I, it kind of collapsed, but it was a slow kind of chipping away at the Ottoman Empire over the last 100 years of its life. But it had been around for 500 years, which is no small feat. But it was an empire in the traditional sense, the old school sense. It wasn't a modern nation state until Ataturk came along, right? You all know Kemal Ataturk. He transformed Turkey from being an empire with all the multi-language, religion, ethnic, et cetera, big territories, to being a Turkish state. We are Turks. He used to say, "Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene," which means I'm proud to be a Turk, and he made everyone say that. Well, who got the raw end of the bad end of the stick on that one? Two peoples. The Armenians, to the tune of 750,000 people killed in that genocide. When Turkey then became a monolithic nation state and caught up to modernity, right, by being this nation state in a proper sense, where Turkish is the language, Turkish is their culture, this is the territory. The problem is that there are Armenians there who also saw that as their territory. They had their own language and their own religion. Two conflicts resulting in 750,000 people being murdered and many others being expelled. So historically, the Armenians would like to be in what Turkey is now, but they're in Armenia, which is not really where they'd like to be. They see their historic home in Turkey. That's one group that got the raw end of the deal. The second group is the Kurds. Now, I'm going to skip over to Iraq and back to Turkey for this reason. When I say there are three groups fighting in Iraq historically, we'd say you have the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds. Well, the Shiites are Shiite Muslim, the Sunnis are Sunni Muslim, and the Kurds are what religion?
Muslim.
Catholic? Muslim. Sunni or Shiite? Neither, right? Why is it that we know that the Arab Sunnis are Sunni and the Arab Shiites are Shiite, but we don't really know the religion? I mean, most people did not. Raise your hand if you didn't know the religion of the Kurds. All right, most people don't know. Why? Because the media does not know how to cover the nuance of really what's going on, and so they use as a shorthand, it's religion. It's not religion, because the Kurds are Sunni Muslim, and who were they fighting? The ISIS or the Arabs who were Sunni Muslim. So the dividing line wasn't Islam and it wasn't religion. But media doesn't know how to cover religion well, and so what they end up doing is simplifying it in a way that makes us less informed rather than more informed. And we end up having this view of religion that really religion isn't to blame, it's nationalism. Because they agreed in that they're all Sunni Muslim, but where did they disagree? The Kurds have their own language, their own culture, their own history, and their own part of Iraq that they historically lived in. And the Arabs had their own part of Iraq that they historically lived in. And the Sunnis were in one part and the Shiites were in another part, and they were all sort of grouped together. They were 3 different provinces, by the way, under the Ottoman Empire, but when the British took over, they put them all together and they said, let's call this Iraq. They carved off Kuwait. Remember that war, the first Gulf War? It's because Iraq said, oh, that used to be part of us, Saddam Hussein. That used to be part of our territory. Let's get it back. He was right. It used to be part. He was a bad guy. I'm not supporting Saddam Hussein, but I'm just saying it was under the Ottomans. It was one country. I mean, it was kind of three provinces, but put together as one country under the British, and it didn't quite work. And so there was this a series of dictatorial rulers that were installed by the British in Iraq and supported by the West. Because remember, Saddam Hussein used to be our friend before he was our enemy. We supported him even as he gassed the Kurds. Donald Rumsfeld is there shaking his hand even after he gassed the Kurds. And we only used that as a negative on his resume when we wanted him out of power. So before that, we were his big supporters as a country, the United States, not we. And so the point that I'm making is that they were forced to live together under this dictatorship. But when you become a democracy, then you have identity politics that come into play. 60% of the population, Shiite Arab. 20% Sunni Arab, 20% Kurdish Sunni, also Sunni Kurdish. And so, they wanted to have like we'll kind of have a semi-independent Kurdistan. That's not really happening. The Sunni Arabs, Saddam was one of them, and they used to be able to rule everything, and now, payback, right? The Shiites who had suffered long under Saddam are kind of exerting their retribution on the the Sunni Arab minority now. And so ISIS was fertile ground there. Who else was supporting ISIS, which arose out of that group? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia. Why? Because they saw there'd be a natural alignment between the Shiite majority and the Iranian regime. And they are opposed to the Iranian regime. Why? Imagine this. Follow the money. Saudi Arabia has this black slippery stuff. What's it called? Oil. The place where the oil is located in Saudi Arabia just happens to have a population that lives there that's Shiite. In Saudi Arabia, 15% of the population of Saudi Arabia is Shiite, and they live where the oil is. Here comes 79, Iranian revolutionary, fervor. They're trying to encourage the Shiite population there to revolt. Of course, if they revolt, they take the land and the oil. So Saudi Arabia is scared to death. And by the way, there was an attempted coup in Saudi Arabia in 1979. Some of you might not even remember that. They took over Mecca. They took over the Kaaba. I was like 8 years old. I don't remember. I read it in history. But there was a revolution. There was an attempted revolution in Saudi Arabia in 1979. Did you remember that? And so it was the standoff, and it lasted for a while. It was very gruesome. Anyway, my point is Saudi Arabia, from that point forward, turned their sights on Iran as their #1 enemy, and Shiite Islam in particular. And so there has been since then this great tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that tension over regional authority and regional power is being perpetuated through a sectarian conflict, which it really isn't about theology. I mean, there is less difference between Sunni and Shia Islam than there is between Reform and conservative Judaism. Much less. You have greater gaps theologically and in ritual practice between Reform and conservative, or between conservative and Orthodox, than there is between Sunni and Shiite Islam. So, to summarize, what's really going on is you have nation states that instrumentalize religion and sometimes sectarian tendencies within religion to promote their own agenda, their own political agenda. And most people who are religiously illiterate, in places like Egypt, 40% of the population, by the way, cannot read or write anything. They're completely illiterate. And on top of that, they're even more religiously illiterate. So they don't even know what their own religion says. So when they are encouraged because of political rhetoric or religious rhetoric that's spread in a propaganda, as propaganda, they are influenced by that tremendously because they're not a lettered people. They're not educated and equipped to process and understand and to evaluate and make their own judgments. So they are heavily influenced by propaganda. Places like Bangladesh, places like Pakistan, tremendous rates of illiteracy. There's an educated elite, but most of the populations are undereducated, and so therefore subject to a lot of propaganda. And this rhetoric, this caustic rhetoric, which is tribalized religion, which is ultranationalism, is really what's behind these conflicts. I will say Israel and Palestine, a quick word about that. So in some ways, the conflict, and I used to TA a course at UCLA on the Israel-Palestine conflict with one of my advisors, Dr. James Gelvin. And he would describe it this way at the beginning of the class. He says, what we have here is a modern real estate dispute between two different nation states or two different nationalist identities who claim as part of their nationalist identity the same territory. And religion is instrumentalized or is used by each side to reaffirm who they are and who the other is, and it leads to conflict because there's, the same territories being claimed by both sides. So what I would say is, as someone who takes religion seriously, and someone of Palestinian background, by the way, my father was born in Jerusalem, my mom's Christian American, but my father was born in Jerusalem and moved to the States in 1956, but I've been back many times. I would say that religion, when done right, tries to inspire me to go beyond my tribal connection to the faith and figure out how it is that we can live together, whether it's there or here, in a way that brings out the most beautiful in one another and recognizes the divine spark, as Rabbi Schulweis said, or as we would say in the Quran, the divine spirit that was breathed into us, that we are enriched by one another's presence, that we are not threatened by one another, but that we have something to offer one another that helps us understand ourselves better, that there's a common ground of values that we can build upon a better today and a better tomorrow for our children. And so religion, when done right, can help us get there.
I want to just ask two more quick questions, and then I'm going to let you ask the next 25 questions. The work you're doing at Claremont, your vision of what you're producing at Claremont, in some ways is an American Islam. So tell us what that vision is. What is an American Islam? You've talked to us about Islam being weaponized, attached to tribal identity, national conflicts. And now you have a chance, as you said before, to raise a generation of Islamic teachers in an American democracy. What does American democracy say to Islam? What is your vision of an American Islam that you're creating?
This is an exciting question for me because it's something I've been giving a lot of thought to. There is a 12th century Muslim theologian named Rabbi Moses bin Maimon. No, I'm sorry, named Al-Ghazali, and Al-Ghazali said about Islam in general. He said, Islam is like a clear, pure water that flows over various lands. It maintains its purity, but it allows the color and the texture of the lands over which it flows to shine through. And so Islam in Africa should look very African, and it does. Islam in Asia or in Indonesia looks very Asian or Indonesian. And Islam in America should look very American. And one of the things that we enjoy, according to Pew, Islam in America is the most ethnically diverse community of faith. We have about a third of our population African American. I mean, you're all familiar with Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Dave Chappelle. No, he's Muslim, but he's probably not the best example of one. Self-admitted. But there are iconic American Muslims who come from the African American community. I knew Muhammad Ali personally. I was a witness on his last will and testament. His wife Lonnie joined our advisory board, and we have a Muhammad Ali scholarship that we offer to those who are working in underserved communities around the country. We have over 19 scholarships that we've issued to black Muslim leaders around the country who enrich our program. So that's 1/3 of our population. About a quarter are Arab in the United States, and about 30% or so are Indo-Pakistani, and then the rest are kind of from all over the rest of the world, and also converts, Latino Americans, Caucasian Americans, et cetera. So we are a very diverse community, and some of those communities are first generation or second generation, but some have been here for quite some time, mostly from the African American side. And so what we have here is really an opportunity to take the most beautiful from each one of those backgrounds, from those traditions, from the food, from the dance, from the music, from all the richness that comes from those deep cultures and tradition, and to create something here that is even more beautiful than any one of those brings to the table. And so this is really our mission. One of our faculty members is a Caucasian American, older gentleman. He converted to Islam back in the 60s and became a very prominent Sufi sheikh and Muslim academic and scholar. He goes by the name of Omar Farouk Abdullah. He's from Chicago. He wrote an article about 15 years ago now called Islam and the what do you call it? American Muslims and the Cultural Imperative. And what he talks about is this idea that we can't take culture for granted, that we have to be creators of culture and not just consumers of culture. And we have to bring something to the table and create some beauty. I remember reading this book written in 1895 by T.W. Arnold, a very prominent Orientalist, who looked at places where Islam took root. And one of the things I would say that one of the challenges that we face in the United States is that religion in general, I say, was under assault by the hegemony of our current culture, in which secularism, if we look to Europe as kind of where we're heading, religion is on the margin of those cultures. And here in the United States, the fastest growing religion are non-religious people, right? So this is something that we both face as Christians, as Muslims, as Jews, that we all face. So how do we give pushback to the tide of the culture that's anti-religious, if you will? And I think our challenge is to create something that's very fulfilling and meaningful through religion to young people, both in terms of spirituality, but also in terms of culture. And I don't have the answer yet for that, but I would say being part of a pluralistic democracy, finding the common ground with people of faith in issues of relevance, of social justice, and in making the world a better place. We have this expression in Islam called tikkun olam. No, that's a Jewish, okay, I'm sorry, that's a Jewish expression, but it's the same value that we have as Muslims. So we have that sort of that common sentiment of trying to make the world a better place. I mean, as the story, I think the last time I was here with Rabbi Schulweis, I told the story of the creation of Adam, if you recall. And Adam's role he was described by God to the angels before he was even created, not as a man, not as a human being, not by any attribute other than by being a Khalifatullahi fil ard, which means a vicegerent, a caretaker for this earth, someone who shall inherit the earth to be responsible for taking care of it, the environment, and those who live on it, one another. So this is our role as human beings. And, I think that, if we get past the tribalism that is our tendency and our comfort zone as a people, and be inspired by religion to be uncomfortable and working across what's familiar with people who share values, then we can really achieve something beautiful by way of placing religion in a higher position in society, and a cultural expression of Islam will then emerge here in the United States.
Thank you. You say in Yiddish, inshallah,
Inshallah.
So,
Inshallah, God willing. That's the next.
Yeah, it's a Yiddish expression. It's, we have just a very, very few minutes, because I promised the Imam's family that I'd get him home. And I want to just ask her a few questions. Louise, if you could carry the microphone to Malka, she gets the first question tonight. Is that okay? So here we go. And I'll switch to the other mic.
So Malka in Arabic either means angel or queen.
Yeah, it means the same thing in Hebrew, yeah.
Same? All right, yes.
It's the same thing in Hebrew.
All right.
We have more than one.
Here it means Rebbitzin, but don't ever say that. So.
First, let me say it's an honor and a privilege to hear you and have you here tonight. My husband would have been overjoyed. I was going to ask a question, and I do want to make a comment as a retired psychotherapist, and that is to understand the splits that occur. Eli, dear, would you just move a little bit over for me? Yeah. The splits that can occur in early modes of cognition, normal growth of cognition, which doesn't change until there is an opening for new learning that you have been describing in the last few minutes. That, the early modality, it's universal, is what we call split thinking. The little one comes home from nursery school and says, oh, he's my best friend. She's my best friend, not my friend, but my best friend. Either or are the words that describe this modality. Normally, that's just delightful growing, right? Except that it has dangers if it isn't grown beyond. And that is superior, inferior. And there are dangers. That is where the danger occurs. When the education and exposure to higher, different, enriching education doesn't shift away from the early modality of splits. Because either or means either you're victorious or defeated. And you can see what damage that would do to identity. Superior and inferior to the morality that you're exposed to. So that element is very, very important to battle and to be concerned about. Not merely the intellectual, but the brain power, the way all aspects of brain experience can easily and normally come into play when there's a speed bump. So that's the comment, but the question that I had in mind was to ask you in terms of the American experience. Are you finding a difference between the older generation and the younger people in the Muslim world here?
I want to respond to your first comment first, because I fully agree with that. And one of the ways that we try and address that at the university at Bayan Claremont and in Muslim communities, broadly speaking, because we train imams, we train religious leaders who go out into the world and lead. is we try and communicate not just rational and intellectualism, but a kind of emotional intelligence, a posture, an attitude, whereby one is, as your I think your grandson here indicated, you have love for yourself and appreciation for the life that God gave you, and you're comfortable enough in your own skin to then go out and give to the rest of the world and not be threatened by difference or be threatened by narrow understandings of oneself or categorizations of the other. But you have something beautiful that you've been gifted by God, and you want to share it, not in the way of proselytizing or converting, but by way of uplifting and inspiring. And so that's something that we embrace at the university and we try and promote. In addition to the learning that the facts and the figures, right? The numbers, the hard learning that takes place. With regards to, what was your question again? The generation gap. I would say it's interesting. I would say that, yes, people who are born and raised here oftentimes have a different mentality than those who came here, but I can't make too broad of a generalization because I've noticed that the kinds of people who came to the United States as immigrants from abroad were often the best and the brightest of the Muslim world, because in 1960s, because of the civil rights movement, by the way, one of the impacts was that we had a broadening of our immigration policy. If you remember, it wasn't all about Europe anymore. It was about opening it up. And it was a little bit merit-based, so we brought a lot of doctors and engineers and the top students to study in our universities from Muslim-majority countries, and they ended up staying here. So there were a lot of bright people who were broad-minded and who got it. And but I would say that people who are born and raised here understand the culture and are more fluent in the American mentality, the American mindset, and really operate in a way that is oftentimes more comfortable moving in and out. Take, for example, someone like Hassan Minhaj. He's the comedian. He has a Netflix series. He identifies himself as, and he's a friend, and I officiated his marriage, and he used to live here in LA before he moved to New York. He is someone who identifies proudly as an Indian from India, because he moved here when he was smaller. He might have been born here, but he was really small and raised in Sacramento. So he's also an American, and he's also a Muslim. And he identifies as all three with complete confidence and transparency. And he's also extremely embracing of one another and unfazed by difference. He embraces it. And it's an attitude and a posture that I think is more prevalent amongst people who were raised with enough knowledge of oneself where they feel they can do that. It's not always generational, and it differs from family to family and culture to culture within families, but I'm hoping that it's the trend, because I think that that's what we need more of.
I want to thank Imam Jihad Turk for being with us tonight. Thank you so very, very much. Wonderful conversation. Before
I got away with one question only, huh?
I was going to have 20 more, but you answered them beautifully. Before we conclude, as long as I have you captive, a couple of very brief announcements. Again, we'll continue our conversation tomorrow afternoon at 12:30 right here, and our guests will be. Are you going to be able to come? We hope you can come.
I'm hoping to be able to make it
come
tomorrow
on back,
as well.
Yeah. In addition to the Imam Jihad, Reverend Mark Whitlock, who's a wonderful Christian teacher, and it'll be an honor to continue this conversation with him as well. A couple of other brief announcements. The synagogue is going to be on a sort of hiatus this week, so we can allow our staff to have their holy days with their families. And we will continue Shabbat, every morning there's minyan, every night there's minyan, because Yossi doesn't know from Christmas. But I should ask you how you get away with no Christmas tree. That's never mind. But every morning and every night, minyan, Shabbos, of course, minyan tomorrow morning, Torah study next week, Torah study, and Shabbat davening. A couple of just brief things that go on in the community. On January 9th, the College of Jewish Studies will continue, and our guest will be Danny Matt from Berkeley, who's the world's leading expert on Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and he'll talk to us about the God we meet. You know him? He's a great teacher.
Sounds
You should invite him.
Yeah.
The God we meet in Jewish mysticism, and everyone is invited. Cantor, where's Cantor Phil? Cantor Phil, stand up. Shabbat Shira will be January 18th. Nava Tehillah is coming to us from Israel. Their music is being sung all over America and Israel, and we're very excited evening. Shabbat Shira, 18th, 7:30. Nava Tehillah, one of the world's great Jewish musical prayer groups, will be here to perform and to lead us in prayer that night, and everyone is invited, and there will be free cookies. In February, the Neshama Minyan is going away for a beautiful spiritual weekend. Nina, stand up. When is the weekend?
February 8th and 9th.
At the Brandeis Bardin, and anyone who wants to come who is remotely female is welcome to come, right? Men, we will have a men's night here together to commiserate that night, but February, what's the date again? February 8th and 9th, a one-night retreat at Brandeis Bardin for the women of the community, a beautiful weekend of learning, of prayer, of gathering together, of being together. It's an out in the middle of a beautiful place, so please join with Nina on that retreat. Anything else I left out, Joshua? Anything else left out? I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.